Rain smeared the restaurant window, distorting the streetlights into greasy yellow streaks. Inside, the clatter of silverware masked the slow, suffocating death of a marriage. "Shut up, or I'll make you—" Bradley hissed his fingers, digging into Sadie's forearm beneath the white linen tablecloth. It was a mundane kind of cruelty, the sort that happens in public every day. What Bradley didn't know was that the man sitting quietly in the booth behind them ran the city's underworld. And he was listening. Roasted garlic and old red wine hung heavy in the air of Lucien's, a restaurant that had been coasting on its Michelin star from a decade ago. Sadie pushed a piece of duck breast around her porcelain plate. The meat was cold. It tasted like copper and regret, though that might have just been her own bitten lip. She kept her eyes focused on the thin smear of plum sauce near the rim. If she looked at the sauce, she didn't have to look at Bradley. Bradley was currently dissecting his sea base with the precision of a man who enjoyed pulling the wings off flies. His jaw worked rhythmically. He hadn't looked at her in 20 minutes, not since they sat down, choosing instead to scroll through his phone with a heavy, deliberate thumb. Sadie shifted her weight on the velvet upholstery. The fabric scratched against her bare legs. "I just think—" She started, her voice coming out thinner than she intended. She cleared her throat, hating the way she had to ask for permission to occupy space. "I just think my sister needs the money, Brad. It's a loan, not a gift." Bradley didn't stop chewing. He didn't lock his phone. He just let the silence stretch. It was his favorite weapon. He let her stew in it, let her feel the embarrassment of being ignored in a room full of people, clinking crystal glasses and laughing. Behind Sadie, the back of her booth was shared with another patron. She could hear the faint rhythmic tap of a leather shoe against the brass footrest. She smelled it before she really registered the man's presence, a scent of sharp vetiver, crushed black pepper, and something distinctly metallic like ozone right before a thunderstorm. It cut through the heavy garlic of the dining room. "Brad." Sadie tried again. Her pulse fluttered in her throat, a trapped moth. "They're going to foreclose. We have that account sitting—" Bradley set his phone face down. The sharp clack of the glass against the marble tabletop made Sadie flinch. She hated herself for the flinch. It was a tiny, involuntary twitch of her shoulder, a physical betrayal of the fear she pretended not to harbor. "Are you finished?" Bradley asked. His voice was perfectly modulated. He never yelled. Yelling was for the lower classes. Bradley preferred to dismantle her quietly. "I'm just asking for a conversation," Sadie whispered, leaning forward so the couple at the table to their left wouldn't hear. Bradley leaned forward, too. He smelled of peppermint mouthwash and expensive sterile gin. His hand dropped below the table. Sadie felt the sudden crushing weight of his fingers wrapping around her forearm just above the wrist. He dug his thumb into the soft underside of her arm, right where the veins ran blue and vulnerable near the surface. "Shut up or I'll make you," Bradley hissed. The words were perfectly enunciated, sliding out between his teeth like razor blades. Sadie stopped breathing. The restaurant noise, the clatter of plates, the hum of jazz from the corner speakers, the dull roar of conversations seemed to get sucked into a vacuum. She looked at his face. His eyes were flat, devoid of anger, which was somehow worse. It was just clinical control. She didn't fight back. She didn't throw her wine in his face or scream for help. Years of this had worn away her edges, leaving her smooth and compliant. She just stared at the knot of his silk tie, a dark burgundy that suddenly reminded her of dried blood. She swallowed the lump of panic in her throat and nodded a tiny, pathetic jerk of her chin. Bradley smiled, releasing her arm and picking up his fork. "Good. Now eat your dinner. You're embarrassing us." In the booth directly behind them, Gabriel Costa sat perfectly still. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop. He had come to Lucien's because it was neutral territory, a place where he could eat a decent steak and drink a glass of Barolo without having to look over his shoulder for a rival crew. He was tired. His bones ached with the kind of fatigue that sleep couldn't fix the weight of running an empire built on violence and extortion. He had spent the afternoon watching a man beg for his life in a damp warehouse. He just wanted an hour of peace, but the couple behind him was ruining his dinner. At first, Gabriel had just tuned them out. The husband's arrogant drone was white noise, but the woman's voice, there was a raw, frayed quality to it that snagged his attention. He took a slow sip of his wine, rolling the heavy liquid over his tongue, and listened to the husband's quiet, violent ultimatum. "Shut up or I'll make you." Gabriel lowered his glass. The bass tapped softly against the table. He didn't care about domestic squabbles. He wasn't a hero. He was a monster by most definitions of the word. He ruined lives for a living. But there was a specific breed of cowardice in the husband's voice that grated on Gabriel's nerves like rusted metal on bone. It was the sound of a weak man who only felt strong when he was terrifying something smaller than himself. Through the mirrored paneling on the wall to his right, Gabriel could see their reflection. He studied the woman. Sadie. She was looking down at her plate, her face pale, her dark hair falling forward to hide her expression. But Gabriel saw the way her hand trembled as she picked up her water glass. He saw the tight, bruised grip of the husband's hand on her arm just moments before. A cold, heavy irritation settled in Gabriel's chest. He didn't feel pity for her. Pity was useless. What he felt was a sudden, violent urge to disrupt the husband's smug little world. Gabriel pushed his plate away. The steak was suddenly unappetizing. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored charcoal suit, his fingers brushing the cold, textured grip of his sidearm. He didn't pull it out. He wouldn't need it. Not for a man like that. He took one last drag of the heavy, oxygen-rich air of the restaurant, letting the irritation crystallize into something sharp and focused. Then he stood up. The scrape of the heavy wooden chair against the floorboards was loud enough to cut through the ambient noise. Sadie blinked, startled out of her numb trance, and looked up. A man was stepping out from the booth behind them. He was tall, moving with a lazy, deliberate grace that immediately made the space around him feel too small. He wasn't classically handsome. His face was too sharp, marked by a faded scar that hooked through his left eyebrow, and his dark eyes carried the exhausted, dead-end look of a man who had seen everything and hated most of it. His suit was dark, perfectly cut, but worn with a negligent ease that suggested he didn't care about the money it cost. Sadie expected him to walk towards the restrooms or the exit. Instead, he stopped directly beside their table. Bradley looked up his brow, furrowing in annoyance at the intrusion. He opened his mouth, likely to snap at the man to watch where he was standing, but the words died in his throat. Gabriel didn't look at Sadie. His dark, heavy gaze was fixed entirely on Bradley. He reached out and rested his large, scarred hands on the back of the empty chair at their table. The knuckles were calloused. "You're ruining my dinner," Gabriel said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a dense gravity that made the air feel suddenly thin. Bradley blinked, a nervous, dismissive laugh escaping his lips. "Excuse me, I think you have the wrong table, pal." Gabriel didn't move. He didn't smile. He just stared down at Bradley with a look of profound, chilling boredom. "I don't. You're sitting here breathing through your mouth, putting your hands on your wife, and it's making my wine taste like vinegar." Sadie felt a cold shock of adrenaline spike through her veins. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at the stranger, her mind scrambling to make sense of the situation. People didn't do this. Nobody ever intervened. They usually just looked away, pretending not to see. Bradley's face flushed a dark, ugly red. The public mask was slipping, replaced by the bruised ego of a small tyrant. "Listen here, you son of a bitch. I don't know who you think you are, but you need to walk away right now before I call the manager and have you thrown out onto the street." Gabriel pulled the empty chair out. The wood groaned in protest. He sat down at their table uninvited, leaning back and crossing one long leg over the other. He rested his arm on the table dangerously close to Bradley's plate. "Call him," Gabriel said, his voice dropping an octave. "Call the manager. His name is Henry. Tell him Gabriel Costa is sitting at your table and you'd like him to throw me out. Let's see what Henri does." At the name Gabriel Costa, the blood drained from Bradley's face so fast he looked as though he might pass out. The angry red flush vanished, leaving behind a sickly, chalky white. Even Sadie, who lived entirely outside the city's brutal underworld, knew the name. It was a name whispered on the local news associated with waterfront union strikes that turned bloody and politicians who suddenly resigned in disgrace. Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. The arrogant set of his shoulders collapsed. Suddenly, the expensive gin and the sharp suit couldn't hide the fact that he was just a terrified suburban accountant sitting across from a predator. "Mr. Costa," Bradley stammered, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. "I apologize. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize I was listening," Gabriel corrected smoothly. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The scent of vetiver and cold metal washed over Sadie. Up close she could see the faint silver threads at his temples, the exhaustion etched deep into the lines around his eyes. "You thought you were in a safe little bubble where you can put your hands on a woman and threaten her because she asked you a question." Bradley was trembling now, visibly. His hands, which had gripped Sadie's arm with such bruising force minutes ago, were shaking so hard he had to press them flat against his thighs beneath the table. It was a misunderstanding. Bradley whispered, his eyes darting frantically towards the restaurant's exit, calculating the distance. "A marital dispute, that's all." Gabriel turned his head slowly and looked at Sadie for the first time. His eyes were a dark, impenetrable brown. They didn't hold pity, which she was grateful for. They held a quiet, terrifying understanding. He looked at the red marks beginning to bloom on her pale forearm. Sadie instinctively reached over and covered the bruises with her other hand, a hot flush of shame burning her cheeks. She was embarrassed that this dangerous stranger was witnessing her pathetic, helpless life. "Did you misunderstand him?" Gabriel asked her. His tone shifted, softening, just a fraction, losing the jagged edge he had used on Bradley. Sadie stared at him. Her throat was bone dry. She looked from Gabriel's scarred, impassive face to her husband. Bradley was staring at her with wide, panicked eyes, silently pleading with her to play along to protect him, to be the good, compliant wife. A bizarre, chaotic mix of emotions warring inside her chest. Terror of the Mafia Boss sitting at her table, shock at the surreal nature of the moment, and rising beneath it all a dark, vicious thrill of vindication. For years Bradley had made her feel small. Now Bradley was the smallest thing in the room. Sadie looked back at Gabriel. She slowly pulled her hand away from her bruised arm, leaving the marks exposed against the white tablecloth. "No," Sadie said, her voice trembling but clear. "I understood him perfectly." Gabriel's gaze lingered on her face for a second longer, something dark and unreadable flickering in his expression. Then he turned back to Bradley. The temperature at the table seemed to plummet 20 degrees. "Hear that, Brad?" Gabriel murmured, leaning in so close that Bradley shrank back into the velvet cushions. "She understood you perfectly. Now I'm going to explain something to you, and I need to make sure you understand me. Nod if you're tracking." Bradley nodded frantically, a bead of sweat tracing down his pale temple. "You're going to stand up," Gabriel instructed, his voice a soft, lethal purr. "You're going to walk to the bar, pay your tab, and leave this restaurant. You're going to leave the car keys with the valet for your wife, and if I ever hear you speak to her like that again, if I ever see you put your hands on her, I won't tell you to shut up. I'll just remove your jaw. Do we have a misunderstanding?" Bradley scrambled out of the booth. He practically crawled over the velvet upholstery in his haste, his leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the polished hardwood. He didn't look at Sadie. He didn't look back at Gabriel. He just kept his head down, a pathetic slump in his expensive suit, and power-walked toward the front of the restaurant, nearly colliding with a waiter carrying a tray of empty flutes. Sadie watched him go. Her chest heaved with shallow, uneven breaths. The adrenaline that had spiked moments ago was crashing, now leaving behind a cold, nauseating void in her stomach. She stared at the empty space where her husband of 6 years had just sat. The crumpled linen napkin he had tossed aside looked like a flag of surrender. He hadn't even hesitated. He hadn't tried to take her with him or shield her. He had simply abandoned her at a table with a predator to save his own skin. Breathe. That voice was a low, abrasive rumble across the marble table. Sadie flinched, her attention snapping violently back to the man sitting in Bradley's chair. Gabriel Costa. He was watching her carefully, his dark eyes cataloguing the fine tremor in her hands, the rapid pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. He didn't offer a comforting smile. He just sat there, heavy and immovable, nursing his own dark irritation. "I'm breathing," Sadie managed to say. Her voice sounded brittle, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. She reached for her water glass, desperate for something to anchor her hands, but her fingers were shaking too badly. The ice clinked violently against the crystal, splashing cold water onto her knuckles. Gabriel reached out and placed his hand over hers, pressing the glass back down to the table. His palm was rough, hot, and calloused. The contact was brief, strictly utilitarian, but the sudden weight of it grounded her. He pulled his hand back immediately, wiping a non-existent drop of condensation from his thumb against his tailored trousers. "You were holding your breath. People pass out when they do that," Gabriel said, leaning back in his chair. He glanced at her half-eaten duck, the plum sauce now congealed and dull. "You want to finish that?" Sadie stared at him, genuinely bewildered. "Do I want to finish my duck? It's a simple question. You just threatened to tear my husband's jaw off." Sadie whispered, acutely aware of the diners at the next table, who were steadfastly pretending not to stare, while absolutely listening to every word. "And you're asking about my entree?" Gabriel sighed a long, exhausted exhalation that ruffled the crisp collar of his dark shirt. He rubbed the bridge of his nose right where the faded scar intersected his left eyebrow. "Look, I'm not a marriage counselor. I don't make a habit of stepping into domestic disputes. It's messy. It's usually a waste of my time." He dropped his hand, his gaze turning flat and cold again. "But he was ruining my dinner." Sadie let out a choked, hysterical sound that might have been a laugh. It tasted like ash. "Right, your dinner. I'm so incredibly sorry we disturbed your meal, Mr. Costa." Gabriel narrowed his eyes slightly, registering the defensive bite in her tone. It surprised him. Most people, when faced with him, defaulted to fawning obedience or paralyzing terror. Her terror was certainly there. He could smell the sharp, metallic tang of fear radiating off her, but there was a hard, stubborn core beneath it that refused to completely buckle. "Don't do that," he warned quietly. "Do what? Get brave because you think I won't hurt you," Gabriel said. It wasn't a threat, just a bleak statement of fact. "I did you a favor. Don't push it." Sadie swallowed hard. The sharp reminder of exactly who she was dealing with snapped her back to reality. She looked down at her lap, her fingers twisting the fabric of her silk dress until the threads strained. "What happens now?" "Now," Gabriel said, checking the heavy steel watch on his left wrist. "You collect your coat, you get in your car, and you go home. Or you go to a hotel. I don't care. The show's over." He stood up, towering over the table. The sudden movement made Sadie instinctively lean back into the cushions. He noticed the flinch, and a muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't comment on it. He reached into his inner pocket, pulled out a thick silver money clip, and tossed a crisp $100 bill onto the table to cover her uneaten meal. "Wait," Sadie said, panic suddenly flaring. She looked around the restaurant, suddenly terrified of being alone. Bradley was gone. He would be waiting at the house. The thought of walking into that dark foyer, waiting for the punishment he would inevitably inflict for this humiliation, made her stomach violently rebel. "I can't go home." Gabriel paused. He looked down at her, his expression hardening into granite. "Not my problem. He'll hurt me," Sadie said. The words tumbled out before she could filter them. They hung in the air, stark and ugly. It was the first time she had ever said it out loud to a living soul. She hadn't even fully realized she believed it until the words left her mouth. But seeing Bradley's eyes earlier, the flat clinical rage when she had simply asked for a conversation, she knew it was true. He wouldn't just yell. He would methodically destroy her for this. Gabriel stared at her. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade again, leaving only the sound of rain lashing against the glass. He studied the pale curve of her neck, the bruised skin on her forearm, that she was no longer trying to hide the desperate, hollow look in her eyes. He was a man who trafficked in violence, who orchestrated pain with the casual indifference of a businessman checking spreadsheets. He shouldn't care. "Walk away," a voice in his head commanded. "You already did too much. She's a civilian." Gabriel cursed softly in Italian under his breath, a harsh, guttural sound. He turned away from the table, staring at the rain-streaked window for a long, agonizing moment. Then he looked back at her. "Get your coat." Gabriel muttered, his voice rough with resentment. "Before I change my mind." Rain drove down in unforgiving sheets as they stepped out from beneath the restaurant's striped awning. The sudden chill bit right through Sadie's thin silk dress, raising painful goosebumps on her arms. She shivered violently, wrapping her trench coat tighter around her waist. The city smelled of wet asphalt, rotting autumn leaves, and pungent exhaust fumes. A valet in a soaked red jacket scrambled forward, holding out a set of silver car keys. "Mr. Hayes left these for you, ma'am. He said you'd be driving yourself home." Sadie reached out her fingers, numb, but Gabriel's large hand intercepted the keys smoothly. He didn't even look at the valet. He just pocketed the silver ring, the metal clinking softly against his leg. Hey!" Sadie protested, her voice barely audible over the hiss of tires on the wet street. "Those are mine. My name is on the registration." "You're shaking," Gabriel stated, stepping closer to her. He didn't offer an umbrella. He just stood in the downpour, letting the cold water darken the broad shoulders of his charcoal suit. "You have the reflexes of a startled rabbit right now. You aren't driving anywhere. You can't just take my keys. I have to go to a hotel. I need—" Gabriel grabbed her elbow. His grip was entirely different from Bradley's. It was firm, completely immovable, but it didn't pinch or bruise. It was simply a physical anchor. He steered her away from the valet stand, walking her down the slick sidewalk toward a heavy black SUV idling in the shadows near the corner alleyway. "Get in," he ordered, pulling the heavy passenger door open. Sadie dug her heels into the wet concrete. The sheer absurdity of the situation finally pierced through her shock. She was fighting with an alleged mob boss on a rain-slicked sidewalk over who was going to drive. "Are you insane? I'm not getting in a car with you. I don't know you." Gabriel stopped. He turned to face her, the streetlights catching the jagged line of his scar. Rainwater dripped from his dark hair, trailing down his jawline. He looked exhausted, deeply and profoundly tired of this entire evening. "You're right. You don't know me," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a harsh, flat register that cut right through the sound of the storm. "I am a bad man. I do terrible things for a living. But right now the man you married is waiting for you in whatever suburban hellhole you live in, and he is going to make you pay for the fact that he wet himself in front of a crowded restaurant. So you have a choice. You can take your keys, get in your car, and go face him. Or you can get in my truck, and I will put you up somewhere safe for the night." He reached into his pocket and dropped her keys onto the wet pavement at her feet. They landed with a sharp, metallic clink that sounded unnaturally loud over the rain. "Choose," Gabriel said. He didn't pressure her. He didn't reach for her again. He just stood there, a dark, imposing figure in the downpour, waiting. Sadie looked at the keys gleaming in an oily puddle. She pictured her house, the long, winding driveway, the heavy oak front door, the way Bradley's footsteps sounded on the hardwood floors when he was angry, measured, unhurried, terrifying. She felt a wave of nausea, so strong she had to close her eyes to keep the world from spinning. She didn't pick up the keys. Instead, she turned and climbed into the idling SUV. Gabriel watched her for a second, his expression utterly unreadable, before he kicked the keys into the gutter drain and slammed the passenger door shut. The interior of the vehicle was a sensory shock. It was dead silent, heavily armored, and insulated against the city noise. The air smelled of rich, dark leather gun oil and the faint, lingering scent of black pepper. The seats were heated instantly, radiating a painful, thawing warmth into Sadie's freezing bones. She pressed herself against the door, putting as much physical space between herself and the driver's seat as the cabin allowed. A moment later, Gabriel slid behind the wheel. The heavy SUV dipped slightly under his weight. He didn't look at her. He shifted the vehicle into drive, pulling seamlessly away from the curb and melting into the slick, neon-lit traffic of the city. They drove in thick silence for a long time. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers cutting away the heavy rain. Sadie watched the city blur past the tinted windows. The familiar downtown skyline slowly gave way to industrial complexes, chain-link fences, and empty warehouses. Panic began to prickle at the back of her neck again. "Where are we going?" she asked, hating how small and frightened her voice sounded in the heavy quiet of the car. "A property I own." "Southside," Gabriel replied, keeping his eyes on the road. His large hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale in the dim dashboard light. "It's secure. Nobody knows about it." "Why are you doing this?" Sadie turned her head to look at his profile. The harsh, brutal angles of his face were illuminated by passing streetlights, casting deep, hollow shadows under his cheekbones. "You said it yourself. You're not a savior. You don't care about domestic disputes." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He signaled and turned down a narrow, unlit street, bordered by high brick walls topped with razor wire. "I blew up your life tonight. That wasn't the plan. I just wanted your husband to shut his mouth. But I pushed him too far, and now you can't go home without a body bag." "So this is guilt?" Sadie asked, a cynical edge creeping into her voice despite her fear. "The big bad Gabriel Costa feels guilty." Gabriel let out a short, humorless breath that fogged the glass for a second. "I don't feel guilt. Guilt is for people who believe they can be redeemed. I believe in taking responsibility for the messes I make. You're a mess I made tonight. That's it. Don't read a romance novel into it." The blunt, transactional nature of his words felt like a physical slap, but strangely it also settled her nerves. It was honest. He wasn't pretending to care about her. She was a liability he was managing. It made him predictable in a grim, detached sort of way. "Fine," Sadie muttered, turning her face back toward the rain-streaked window. She pulled her knees up tight against her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs in a defensive curl. "I'm a mess you made. Just drop the mess off somewhere with a lock on the door, and we can both pretend this never happened." Gabriel glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. He took in the tight, defensive posture, the wet hair plastered to her pale neck, the bruises already turning a deep, angry purple on her delicate wrist. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel until the leather groaned under the pressure. "Yeah," Gabriel said softly, the word barely audible over the hum of the powerful engine. We'll pretend. Gravel crunched beneath the heavy tires, a harsh grinding sound that signaled the end of their silent drive. Gabriel steered the SUV through a narrow, unlit alleyway, choked with rusted dumpsters and stacked wooden pallets, finally stopping before a featureless corrugated metal door. He pressed a small button on the overhead console. The door groaned upward on ungreased tracks, revealing a pitch-black concrete garage. He pulled inside, killing the engine before the door even registered its descent. The sudden absence of the motor's low hum left a ringing void in Sadie's ears. "Stay here," Gabriel ordered. He stepped out into the dark. Sadie didn't move. She watched his silhouette move methodically around the perimeter of the garage. The sharp mechanical clack-clack of him checking a heavy iron side door echoed against the concrete walls. The air in the garage smelled of motor oil, damp earth and exhaust. It was cold. Colder than the car, but warmer than the rain-soaked streets. A heavy thud sounded from the driver's side. Gabriel pulled her door open. The dim interior lights flickered on, casting long, pale shadows across his face. "We walk up. It's 2 flights. Sadie uncurled her legs. Her joints felt stiff, locked tight by adrenaline and the biting cold of her wet dress. She slipped out of the high leather seat, her heels clicking awkwardly against the uneven concrete floor. Gabriel didn't offer a hand to steady her. He simply locked the vehicle and walked toward a steel door at the back of the garage, expecting her to follow. The stairwell was narrow, lit by a single caged bulb that buzzed with an irritating, erratic frequency. The air grew stale as they climbed, smelling of old dust and cold iron. Gabriel moved with silent, predatory efficiency, his heavy shoes barely making a sound on the metal grating. Sadie, shivering in her ruined silk and trench coat, felt like a clumsy, dragging weight behind him. At the landing, Gabriel pulled a ring of keys from his pocket. He unlocked 3 separate deadbolts, the heavy metallic snaps echoing down the stairwell, before pushing the thick, reinforced door open. He reached inside and flicked a switch. The apartment was not what Sadie expected. There was no opulent Italian leather, no cigar smoke, no marble. It was a cavernous, stripped-down industrial loft. Exposed brick walls flanked a massive central living space. The floors were scuffed hardwood, dulled by years of neglect. A grey canvas sofa sat in the center of the room, facing a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, though heavy blackout curtains were drawn tight across them, sealing the room from the outside world. It felt entirely transient, a place for ghosts to sleep. "Lock it behind you," Gabriel said, dropping his keys onto a battered wooden kitchen island. Sadie stepped over the threshold. She pushed the heavy door shut, twisting the 3 brass locks until they clicked into place. The finality of the sound made her stomach pitch. She was locked in a secure bunker with a man whose name made politicians sweat. Yet staring at the deadbolts, she realized a terrifying truth. She felt safer on this side of the door than she would have in her own suburban bedroom. Gabriel shrugged out of his soaked suit jacket, tossing it over the back of a bar stool. The white dress shirt beneath it clung to the broad span of his shoulders, damp with rain. He didn't look at her. He walked directly to a narrow hallway off the kitchen, his posture rigid with an exhaustion he was desperately trying to ignore. "Bathroom is the first door on the right." His voice drifted back, rough and flat. "Towels are under the sink. There's a clean shirt on the bed in the room at the end of the hall. Put it on. You're shivering so hard I can hear your teeth." Sadie stood frozen in the center of the vast, empty room. Her coat dripped onto the hardwood, leaving a small, dark puddle. "Where are you going?" Gabriel paused in the hallway. He didn't turn around. He just tilted his head slightly, a dark silhouette against the pale drywall. "To make a phone call. And pour a drink. Do you need me to hold your hand?" The sarcasm snapped her out of her stupor. "No." "Then go." Sadie walked toward the bathroom. The door was heavy, solid wood. Inside the space was aggressively utilitarian white subway tile, a deep porcelain tub, a single mirror bordered by harsh vanity lights. She locked the door, leaning her weight against the wood for a long, fractured minute. The silence of the loft was absolute. No rain, no traffic, no jazz music. She peeled off the trench coat. It hit the tiled floor with a heavy, wet slap. The silk dress followed. Turning to the mirror, Sadie braced her hands against the cold porcelain edge of the sink. She looked terrible. Her dark hair was plastered in chaotic, wet strands against her pale cheeks. Her mascara had smudged, leaving bruised-looking shadows under her eyes. But it was her right arm that commanded her attention. She lifted it under the harsh light. The fingerprints were already blooming into distinct, ugly ovals of dark purple and angry red against her pale skin. Bradley's grip. She traced the edge of the largest bruise with a trembling fingertip. It ached a deep, pulsing throb in the muscle. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the sudden sharp sting of tears. She refused to cry here. She refused to break down in Gabriel Costa's sterile, echoing bathroom. Sadie turned the heavy chrome faucet. Freezing water rushed into the basin. She cupped her hand, splashing the icy water over her face, scrubbing away the ruined makeup, the smell of the restaurant, the lingering scent of Bradley's peppermint breath. She scrubbed until her skin felt raw. When she finally turned the water off, she found a thick grey towel in the cabinet below. It smelled like unscented detergent and ozone. She dried her face, her hair, her shivering shoulders. She wrapped the towel around herself and stepped back into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind her. The door at the end of the hall was ajar. Inside, a sparse bedroom held a mattress on a simple iron frame. Folded neatly at the foot of the bed was a dark grey cotton t-shirt. It was enormous. Sadie pulled it over her head. The fabric swallowed her, dropping down to her mid-thigh. It felt soft, worn thin from years of washing. It didn't smell like Gabriel's sharp vetiver cologne. It just smelled clean like hot cotton straight from a dryer. She sat on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned softly. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs in the oversized shirt. Outside this room in the main living area, she could hear the faint, muffled clink of glass against glass. She was a liability, a mess he had made. And tomorrow the sun was going to come up, and Bradley would still be her husband. Sleep was a biological impossibility. The mattress was firm to the point of hostility, and the heavy blackout curtains made it impossible to tell if it was 3 a.m. or high noon. Sadie lay flat on her back, staring at the pitch-black ceiling. Her mind raced in agonizing, repetitive loops. Bradley at the table. Gabriel's heavy hand on the wooden chair. The clatter of her keys hitting the wet pavement. He's going to freeze the accounts, she realized, the thought piercing the darkness like a physical blade. Bradley was a forensic accountant for a massive logistics firm. He understood money, how to hide it, how to move it, how to cut someone off from it entirely. Her name was on the joint checking account, but Bradley held the passwords, the security keys, the primary authorization. By morning, her credit cards would be useless pieces of plastic. A suffocating panic seized her throat. She had $50 in her purse and a dead cell phone. Sadie threw off the thin cotton blanket. The hardwood floor was freezing against her bare feet as she padded out of the bedroom and down the dark hallway. A dim amber light bled from the kitchen area. Gabriel was sitting on one of the wooden bar stools, his elbows resting on the kitchen island. He had changed into dry clothes, a pair of faded black denim jeans and a simple fitted black t-shirt that clung to the dense muscle of his chest and shoulders. A half-empty bottle of amber liquid sat next to a thick glass tumbler. He wasn't looking at a phone or a laptop. He was just staring at the grain of the wood, lost in some dark, inaccessible thought. He didn't look up when she entered, though she knew he heard her. Men like him didn't miss footsteps in the dark. "There's water in the fridge." Gabriel said, his voice a low, raspy scrape in the quiet room. Sadie walked to the stainless steel refrigerator. The hum of the compressor was loud as she opened the door, blinding herself momentarily with the harsh internal light. She grabbed a plastic bottle, cracked the seal, and drank deeply. The cold water shocked her empty stomach, but it cleared the metallic taste of fear from her mouth. She closed the fridge and leaned against it, the cool metal soothing through the thin fabric of Gabriel's shirt. "I don't have any money," Sadie said softly. Gabriel finally turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them resembling bruises in the low light. He looked at her. Really looked at her, taking in the way the oversized shirt hung off her fragile frame, the defensive way she crossed her arms over her chest. "Your husband's an accountant," Gabriel stated. It wasn't a question. "Forensic," Sadie corrected, her voice trembling slightly. "He tracks missing funds for corporate buyouts. He handles all our finances. He insists on it. If I try to use my card tomorrow, it will decline. I know it will. He'll empty the joint account and move it somewhere I can't touch it." Gabriel picked up his glass. The amber liquid swirled, catching the dim light. "He's punishing you. Taking away the resources so you have to crawl back." "I won't crawl back." Sadie's voice was sharper this time, surprising them both. Gabriel took a slow sip of his drink. He swallowed the muscle in his thick neck working. "Don't make promises you can't afford to keep, Sadie. Pride is expensive. Hunger is cheap. I'm not going back to him," she repeated, pushing off the refrigerator. She walked toward the island, stopping a few feet away from where he sat. "He didn't just grab my arm tonight, Gabriel. This isn't the first time. It's just the first time he did it where anyone could see. If I go back, he will make me pay for the fact that you humiliated him. He will lock the doors, and he will methodically break me down. I can't go back." Gabriel set the glass down. The soft clink echoed in the vast room. He studied her face. The trembling rabbit from the restaurant was gone, replaced by a woman backed into a corner, clutching onto a fragile, desperate anger. "You think he's smart?" Gabriel asked quietly. Sadie frowned, thrown by the question. "Yes, he's brilliant with numbers. That's why he's dangerous." "Numbers don't make a man dangerous!" Gabriel scoffed, a dark, cynical humor touching the corner of his mouth. "Violence makes a man dangerous. Leverage makes a man dangerous. Your husband is a spreadsheet jockey who gets off on terrifying a woman who weighs 100 pounds less than him. He isn't smart. He's just mean." "It amounts to the same thing when he holds all the cards." Gabriel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the island. The scent of the dark liquor mixed with the sharp, clean smell of soap on his skin. "He doesn't hold the cards anymore. I kicked the table over. And now what?" Sadie demanded, her frustration boiling over. "You kick the table over, you put me in a bunker, and tomorrow you go back to running your whatever it is you run, and I'm stuck out in the cold with $50 and a bruised arm. You didn't save me, Gabriel. You just changed the timeline." Gabriel didn't flinch at her tone. He just absorbed the anger, his dark eyes fixed on her face. For a long moment, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic hum of the building's central heating unit kicking on. He reached out his large hand, moving slowly across the wooden counter until his index finger tapped against the dark glass of the liquor bottle. "I told you," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a deadly, serious register that sent a shiver down Sadie's spine. "I take responsibility for the messes I make. Bradley Hayes thinks he owns you because he holds the bank passwords. By noon tomorrow, Bradley is going to realize that money doesn't mean a goddamn thing when Gabriel Costa is looking at his ledgers." Sadie stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do what I do best," Gabriel replied, picking up his glass and draining the last of the liquor. He set it down hard. I'm going to ruin him." Waking up in Gabriel Costa's bed felt like surfacing from deep, muddy water. Sadie gasped, her lungs pulling in the cold, unfamiliar air of the bedroom. The oversized cotton shirt twisted tightly around her thighs. She lay rigid, bracing for the familiar, agonizing dread of Bradley's heavy footsteps in the hall. It took 10 agonizing seconds for the concrete reality of the industrial loft to crash over her. She was alone. The apartment was utterly silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Sadie pushed herself up. Her muscles ached deeply, bruised from tension, and the dark, purple ovals on her right arm throbbed with a dull, steady rhythm. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, her bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood. In the kitchen, the bar stool Gabriel had occupied hours ago was empty. Sitting squarely on the battered wooden island was a matte black burner phone, a steaming cup of black coffee in a paper cup, and a single silver key on a plain ring. No note, no romantic instructions, just the crude mechanics of survival. Sadie wrapped her cold hands around the paper cup. The coffee was bitter, scalding, and perfect. She stared at the burner phone, resisting the urge to turn it on and dial her sister. Bradley would be monitoring her family's phones by now. He was vindictive, but he was also methodical. He would construct a narrative where she was unstable, erratic, a woman who abandoned her marriage in a hysterical fit. Miles away in a high-rise office entirely made of glass and polished steel, Gabriel stepped out of an elevator. He didn't belong in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of Apex Logistics. His charcoal suit was expensive, but it lacked the soft, harmless tailoring of corporate America. He moved with a heavy, predatory mass that made the junior analysts in the cubicles instinctively pull their chairs closer to their desks as he passed. Gabriel bypassed the receptionist entirely, ignoring her panicked, reedy voice calling out for security. He pushed through a set of heavy, frosted glass doors at the end of the hall and stepped into a corner office. Bradley sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, a phone pressed to his ear, his fingers flying across a mechanical keyboard. He smelled of nervous sweat and fresh mint. When he looked up and saw Gabriel closing the glass door behind him, the color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like a corpse. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering loudly against the desktop. Gabriel didn't speak. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick manila folder, and dropped it onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "What is this?" Bradley stammered, his eyes darting toward the glass walls, realizing with sickening clarity that the rest of the office was watching, but no one was coming to help. Gabriel's men were already standing by the elevators. "Your life," Gabriel said softly. He pulled up a leather guest chair and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. Or rather, the end of it. Bradley reached for the folder with a trembling hand. He flipped it open. The pages inside were not printed from a bank. They were highly classified ledger printouts complete with routing numbers, offshore dummy corporations, and digital signatures. "I made a few phone calls this morning." Gabriel murmured, his dark eyes tracking the frantic twitch of a muscle in Bradley's jaw. "You're a very talented forensic accountant, Brad. You found a lot of hidden money for this firm. But you also found a rather large blind spot in their overseas shipping accounts, didn't you? A blind spot you've been using to siphon roughly $200,000 over the last 3 years into a Cayman shell company." Bradley's chest began to heave. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The arrogant, controlling husband from the restaurant was completely gone, replaced by a cornered rat choking on its own panic. "I didn't," Bradley choked out finally. "That's not... You fabricated this." "I didn't have to," Gabriel replied, leaning back in the chair. "You're sloppy. You thought because you were stealing from a faceless corporation nobody would look twice. But the people you're stealing from, Brad, they outsource their security to a firm that owes me a very large favor. Those ledgers are authentic. and they are currently sitting in an email draft ready to be sent to the federal prosecutor's office and to your board of directors. Bradley shrank back into his ergonomic chair. The leather squeaked under his weight. What do you want? I have money. I can pay you. Gabriel let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't touch his eyes. You think I want your pennies? I want you to open your laptop. Right now, you're going to wire every single dollar from your joint accounts into a new trust I set up this morning. Then you're going to sign the divorce papers my attorney is currently faxing to your machine. You will waive all rights to alimony property and contested assets. You can't do this, Bradley whispered, a tear of pure, pathetic terror tracking down his cheek. She's my wife. Gabriel stood up. The sudden violence of the movement made Bradley flinch hard, raising his arms to cover his face. Gabriel leaned over the desk, invading Bradley's space, bringing the smell of cold ozone and danger with him. She was your victim. Gabriel corrected his voice, a lethal, vibrating growl. Now she is my problem, and I am removing you from the equation. Transfer the money, Brad, or I send the emails and you spend the next 10 years in federal prison being traded for a carton of cigarettes. Waiting was its own kind of violence. Sadie paced the length of the hardwood floor, her bare feet picking up a layer of invisible grit. The loft smelled of old dust and the sharp ozone of a brewing storm outside. She had checked the locked door 3 times. She had stared at the burner phone until her eyes watered, resisting the gravitational pull of her old life. It was mid-afternoon when the heavy metallic grind of the deadbolts finally shattered the quiet. Sadie froze by the kitchen island, her hands gripping the wooden edge so hard her knuckles turned white. Gabriel stepped through the doorway. He looked worse than he had last night. His charcoal suit jacket was slung over one shoulder, his tie was gone, and the top 2 buttons of his collar were undone. Exhaustion radiated from him in heavy, invisible waves, deepening the harsh lines around his mouth and the jagged hook of his scar. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply walked to the island, tossed a thick beige envelope onto the wood, and walked past her toward the refrigerator. What is that? Sadie asked, her voice cracking slightly in the dry air of the apartment. Gabriel pulled out a bottle of water, twisting the plastic cap off with a sharp snap. He took a long drink before looking at her. It's your out. Sadie reached out tentatively. Her fingers brushed the rough paper of the envelope. It felt heavy. She pulled the metal clasp open and slid the contents onto the counter. A stack of legal documents printed on thick bond paper stared back at her. On top was a banking confirmation receipt bearing a wire transfer number and a balance that made her breath catch in her throat. It was everything. Every dime they had saved, every asset they shared, cleanly liquidated and moved. Beneath it were divorce papers. Bradley's signature was already scrawled at the bottom, the ink dark and erratic, the signature of a man whose hand was shaking violently. How? Sadie whispered, staring at the blue ink as if it might spontaneously combust. He would never just give this up. He would fight. He would drag it out for years just to make me suffer. He didn't have a choice, Gabriel said. He leaned his hip against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He watched her process the paperwork. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked like a man who had finished a tedious, dirty job. I found a secondary ledger he was keeping at his firm. He was skimming. I gave him a choice between signing those papers or spending the rest of his life eating off a metal tray. Sadie looked up from the papers. Her mind struggled to connect the terrified, compliant signature with the monster she had lived with for 6 years. The man who dictated her grocery lists, who bruised her arms for speaking out of turn, had been completely dismantled in less than 12 hours by the man standing in front of her. You blackmailed him, she stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a realization of the brutal mechanics of Gabriel's world. I applied leverage, Gabriel corrected flatly. Blackmail implies I want something from him on an ongoing basis. I don't. I just wanted him gone. He's gone." A strange, hollow sensation bloomed in Sadie's chest. It wasn't joy. Joy was too light a word for this. It was a staggering, terrifying vertigo. For years the walls of her cage had been so small, so defined by Bradley's moods and rules. Now the cage was gone, leaving her standing in a vast, empty expanse. She had money. She had freedom. And she had absolutely no idea how to survive it. A choked, ugly sob tore out of her throat. She slapped a hand over her mouth, immediately mortified, but the dam had broken. The adrenaline, the terror of the restaurant, the freezing rain, the absolute shock of the divorce papers, it all crashed down at once. She squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders shaking violently as she leaned her weight against the kitchen island, trying to muffle the sounds of her own fracture. Gabriel didn't move to hold her. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell her everything was going to be okay. He knew better than anyone that okay was a fragile, temporary illusion. Instead, he took a step closer, placing his large, calloused hand flat on the wooden counter inches from hers. The heat radiating from his skin was palpable. He didn't touch her, but the proximity, the solid, immovable mass of him, acted as an anchor in the chaotic storm of her panic. "Breathe!" Gabriel commanded, his voice a low, rough rumble. Sadie gasped, sucking in air through her fingers. "I don't know what to do next. I don't know who I am without him telling me. You're a woman with a fully funded trust account and no dead weight," Gabriel said bluntly. He watched a tear slide down her pale cheek, catching the dim overhead light. "You figure it out one day at a time. You buy a different brand of coffee. You sleep in the middle of the bed. You stop flinching when someone speaks." Sadie lowered her hand. Her chest heaved, her eyes red and burning as she looked up into his dark, exhausted face. "Why did you do this for me, really? You don't know me. I'm just a woman from a restaurant." Gabriel looked away, his jaw tightening. The muscles in his neck jumped. For a second he looked incredibly vulnerable, a crack in the granite facade of the ruthless mob boss. Because a long time ago, Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "Someone I loved sat at a table just like that, and nobody pulled the chair out for her. Nobody kicked the table over." He looked back at Sadie, his eyes completely flat and devoid of light. "I couldn't save her, so I ruined him instead. Consider your debt paid." The heavy silence returned thicker this time, pressing against the exposed brick of the loft. Sadie stared at Gabriel. The confession hung between them, a jagged piece of shrapnel from a war he had fought long before she ever walked into Lucian's. She didn't ask who the woman was. A sister, a mother, a wife, it didn't matter. The ghosts in Gabriel's eyes told her the ending of that story. She looked down at the divorce papers. The blue ink of Bradley's signature seemed to blur. For years she had believed her husband was an immovable mountain, a permanent fixture blocking out the sun. Gabriel had reduced him to a terrified, compliant signature on a piece of bond paper in less than a day. "Thank you," Sadie said. The words felt incredibly small, violently insufficient for the magnitude of what lay on the wooden counter. Gabriel turned away. He walked over to the windows, pulling the heavy blackout curtain back just a few inches. The grey, bruised light of late afternoon filtered in, casting long, sharp shadows across the scuffed floorboards. It was still raining, a miserable, persistent drizzle. "Don't thank me," Gabriel muttered, keeping his back to her. He watched the street below, his posture rigid, his broad shoulders tight with unspent tension. "I didn't do it to be a good person. I did it to settle a score in my own head. We're even. You have your life back, and I don't have to listen to a coward ruin my dinner." Sadie carefully slid the papers back into the thick beige envelope. She folded the metal clasp down. The rough texture of the paper grounded her, anchoring her to the present reality. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a woman with a loaded bank account and 0 tethers. "So this is it?" she asked, her voice steadier now. The panicked trembling in her hands had finally subsided, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "I just walk out the door." Gabriel let the curtain drop. The room plunged back into amber-lit gloom. He turned to face her, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dark denim jeans. "There's a black sedan idling in the alley behind the garage. The driver's name is Thomas. He's on my payroll, and he doesn't ask questions. He'll take you to the St. Regis. I had a room booked under your maiden name, paid for a month in advance." Sadie blinked, surprised by the meticulous, clinical level of his planning. "A month. It takes time to buy a new wardrobe, find an apartment, and hire a lawyer to make sure Bradley doesn't try anything stupid when he inevitably realizes I'm not watching him anymore," Gabriel said flatly. "Though he won't. He's too obsessed with his own survival to risk it." Sadie looked down at herself. She was still wearing his oversized grey t-shirt. Her silk dress was a wrinkled, damp ruin lying somewhere on the bathroom floor. "I can't go to the St. Regis looking like this." Gabriel walked toward the kitchen island. He picked up the silver key ring he had left for her earlier and held it out. "Take the stairs to the basement. There's a canvas duffel bag in the trunk of the car. It has a change of clothes, sweatpants, a jacket. Nothing fancy, but it won't get you arrested for vagrancy in a hotel lobby." She reached out and took the keys. Her fingers brushed his palm. His skin was rough-hot and calloused, a stark contrast to her cold, pale hands. She held the keys tightly, the jagged metal biting comfortably into her skin. "You planned all this," Sadie observed, looking up at his sharp, exhausted face. "You set up the trust, threatened my husband, booked a hotel, and packed a bag. You were entirely sure I was going to leave him." "I was sure," Gabriel corrected, his voice dropping into that dark, quiet register that made the air feel suddenly thin, "that if you went back to him, I would eventually have to kill him. And I am trying very hard to limit the number of bodies I bury these days." It wasn't a joke. The grim sincerity in his dark eyes made Sadie's breath hitch. He lived in a brutal, violent ecosystem, and he had dragged her out of her own domestic nightmare using the only tools he possessed: intimidation, leverage, and force. Sadie walked towards the hallway to grab her damp trench coat. When she returned to the kitchen, she slipped it on over the oversized t-shirt. It was an absurd outfit, a high-end tailored trench coat over a faded grey tee, her bare feet pale against the dark wood floor. But for the first time in 6 years, she didn't care what she looked like. She wasn't dressing for Bradley's approval. She was dressing for survival. Gabriel stood by the heavy, reinforced door. He didn't open it for her. He waited for her to approach. Sadie stopped a foot away from him. Up close, she could smell the stale coffee, the damp rain, and the faint, bitter tang of gunpowder clinging to his clothes. He was a monster to the city, a predator who ruined lives without blinking. But to her, he was the earthquake that finally shattered her cage. "Will I ever see you again?" Sadie asked quietly, clutching the beige envelope to her chest like a shield. Gabriel looked down at her. His gaze tracked over her bruised arm, the pale curve of her neck, and finally settled on her eyes. There was no cinematic softness in his expression, just a bleak, hollow acknowledgement of two people from completely different worlds colliding for a violent, fleeting moment. "No," Gabriel said. His voice was a rasping scrape in the quiet loft. "If you see me again, Sadie, it means you took a wrong turn. Keep walking forward and don't look back." He reached past her and unlocked the 3 deadbolts. Clack, clack, clack! He pulled the heavy steel door open, letting the cold, damp draft of the stairwell wash over them. Sadie stepped out onto the metal landing. She didn't look back. She clutched the envelope, tightened the belt of her trench coat, and walked down into the dark, carrying the heavy, terrifying weight of her new life. What an intense journey. Sadie finally has her freedom. But escaping a toxic past is never completely clean, especially when it involves the city's most dangerous man. If Gabriel and Sadie's dark, thrilling encounter kept you hooked until the very last word, smash that like button right now. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you think they'll ever cross paths again? Or did Gabriel really walk away for good? Drop your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping, raw romance stories. See you next time.